When my mother-in-law moved into our home without asking, I thought things couldn't get any worse. Then she demanded that I give her the master bedroom while I slept on the couch. I let her stay, at first. But what happened next made her pack up and leave forever. It all started on a random Tuesday evening, one of those uneventful nights when you just want to relax and forget about the workday. My husband and I were curled up on the couch, half watching a rerun of some sitcom, when the sound of a car pulling into our driveway broke the quiet. "Are we expecting anyone?" I asked, glancing at my husband. He shook his head, looking just as confused as I felt. I peeked through the window and froze. It was my mother-in-law's car, and it looked like she was moving in. The trunk was open, and there were suitcases, boxes, and even a lamp sticking out. She was already halfway to the door, her purse slung over her shoulder, and a determined look on her face. "What this?" I muttered, but before I could finish the thought, she walked in like she owned the place. "Oh, good, you're home," she announced, dropping her purse onto the kitchen counter. I thought I'd beat the traffic. I blinked, trying to process what was happening. "Hi, Mom," my husband said cautiously. "What's going on?" She let out an exaggerated sigh, like she'd been carrying the weight of the world. My apartment lease ended, and I decided not to renew. You know how expensive it is these days, and with the way the economy is, this just made sense. So here I am. She gestured around as if she were unveiling a grand surprise. I stared at her, waiting for the part where she said she'd found a temporary rental or was crashing for a weekend. It never came. "You're staying here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Well, of course. Where else would I go?" "This is the obvious choice," she said, brushing past me to look around the living room. "Don't worry, I'll make myself comfortable. You won't even notice I'm here." That last sentence nearly made me laugh out loud.
Yeah, right.
She was already taking over, and she hadn't even unpacked. I turned to my husband, silently pleading for him to step in and explain, but the look on his face told me he was just as blindsided. "Mom, you didn't think to call us first?" he asked, his voice somewhere between confusion and annoyance. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she replied with a wave of her hand. "We're family. Families help each other out. It's not a big deal." I wanted to argue. I wanted to yell, "This is a huge deal," but I was too stunned to say anything. Instead, I watched as she started hauling in her suitcases, one by one, without waiting for an answer. That night, I pulled my husband aside after she went to bed. On the couch, thankfully. "This isn't okay," I said in a low voice, careful not to wake her. "She can't just show up unannounced and move in without asking." "I know," he said, rubbing his temples. "But what do we do? She's already here. We can't just kick her out." I sighed. He was right, but it didn't make the situation any less frustrating. "We need to set some boundaries," I said firmly. "If she's staying, there have to be rules. This is our house, not hers." He nodded, agreeing with me for the most part. But before we could even figure out how to approach her about it, she dropped her first bombshell the next morning. I was in the kitchen, pouring my coffee, when she walked in with a bright, cheerful smile. "Oh, by the way," she said casually, like she was asking for the salt. "I'll need the master bedroom. It just makes sense." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Excuse me?" "Well, think about it," she said, completely unfazed. "I have more stuff than you do, and I need the extra space. Plus, my back isn't what it used to be, so the bigger bed would really help. You and husband can just sleep in the guest room, or even on the couch if it's more convenient. It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal?" I was so angry I could barely form words. "That's not happening," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She gave me a little shrug, like I was the unreasonable one. "Well, we'll see," she said, turning her attention to the newspaper she'd brought into the kitchen. I shot a look at my husband, who had just walked in. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "Mom, that's not going to work," he said weakly. "Oh, don't be silly," she said with a laugh. "We'll figure it out." I felt a knot forming in my stomach. This was going to be worse than I thought. At first, I genuinely thought she was joking. I mean, who waltzes into someone else's house uninvited and demands the master bedroom? It was absurd. But the way she stood there, arms crossed, that confident little smirk on her face, it hit me. She was completely serious. "You and husband can just sleep on the couch or the guest bed," she said, as if she were suggesting what to have for dinner. "I need the space for my things and my comfort. The master bedroom just makes sense, don't you think?" I stood there, mouth slightly open, trying to process the audacity of it all. No, I said flatly, breaking the awkward silence. That's not happening. Her smile faltered, replaced by a look of mild disbelief, like she couldn't understand why I wasn't immediately agreeing. Oh, come on, she said, waving her hand as if dismissing my resistance. It's not a big deal. It's just a room. You're young, you'll manage. My husband walked in right as I was about to lose it. He could sense the tension in the air immediately. What's going on? He asked, looking between the two of us. I opened my mouth to explain, but she beat me to it. I was just saying how the master bedroom would be a better fit for me, she said, her tone as sweet as honey. You know, with my back issues and all the extra things I need to store. It's not like I'm asking for much. My husband blinked, clearly caught off guard. Mom, the guest room is perfectly fine for you. That's why we have it. She huffed, throwing her hands up dramatically. The guest room is tiny. It's like a closet. I can't possibly fit all my things in there. Besides, the bed is too firm. You know how sensitive my back is. It was taking everything in me to keep my composure. The guest room is more than adequate, I said firmly, crossing my arms. We're not moving out of our bedroom. End of discussion. She gave me a look, half disbelief, half disdain, and muttered under her breath, so selfish. I snapped. Excuse me? Oh, nothing, she said, feigning innocence. I just think it's interesting how some people prioritize their comfort over their family's needs. But it's fine. I'll make do. My husband stepped in before I could fire back. Mom, let's just get you settled in the guest room for now, okay? He was trying to stay calm, but I could tell he was just as annoyed as I was. Fine, she said with a dramatic sigh, like she was doing us a favor. But don't blame me when I'm tossing and turning all night and can't sleep. She spent the next hour sulking while unpacking her things in the guest room, making little passive-aggressive comments loud enough for me to hear. I guess I'll just have to cram everything in here, she said at one point, opening the closet and giving an exaggerated gasp. Wow, this is small. I refused to engage. I wasn't going to let her bait me into an argument. Instead, I focused on reclaiming my space. After she went to bed, I locked the door to our bedroom, something I'd never felt the need to do before. That night, my husband and I had another serious talk. This can't continue, I told him. She's already trying to take over, and she's only been here for a day. I know, he said, rubbing his face in frustration. But what do we do? She's my mom. I can't just kick her out. I'm not saying we kick her out, I said, though the idea was tempting. But we need to set boundaries. Real ones. She doesn't get to dictate how we live in our own home. He nodded, but I could tell he was torn. He loved his mom, but even he was starting to see how unreasonable she was being. For the next few days, things were tense. She made a point of being extra dramatic about how uncomfortable the guest room was, leaving the door open so we could hear her exaggerated groans every time she lay down. She even started hinting to my husband that I was being unfair to her. She's your wife, I overheard her saying one evening when she thought I wasn't around. Shouldn't she be more accommodating to your families? To his credit, my husband stood up for me. Mom, this is our home. You're a guest here, and you need to respect that. The guest room is fine. It's more than most people would offer. Her response? A dramatic sigh followed by, I guess I'll just have to learn to suffer in silence. I wanted to scream. Instead, I told myself to pick my battles. Fine, she could have her pity party. As long as she stayed out of my room, I could handle it for now. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, her behavior went from mildly irritating to outright infuriating. She started reorganizing my kitchen, commenting on my housekeeping, and even letting herself into our bedroom when she thought we weren't home. But that's a story for another chapter. For now, all I could do was brace myself for the chaos that was clearly on its way. The first week of my mother-in-law living with us was nothing short of a waking nightmare. It started with little things, small annoyances I tried to brush off, telling myself I was overreacting. She rearranged my spice rack without asking, claiming her method was more efficient. Then she moved on to the pantry, insisting that I'd been storing things in the wrong order. This isn't logical, she'd say, holding up a box of cereal like it offended her. The baking supplies should go here, and the snacks should be on this shelf. Don't you want things to flow better? I gritted my teeth and nodded, too drained to argue. I thought maybe she'd stop there, but of course she didn't. Within days, she had reorganized nearly every cabinet in the kitchen. When I went to make dinner, I couldn't find anything. My pots and pans were in different drawers, and even the silverware had been moved. "Where's the spatula?" I asked one evening, rummaging through a drawer that used to hold all my utensils. "Oh, I moved it," she said from the living room, not bothering to look up from the TV. It made more sense to put it in the drawer next to the oven. "You're welcome." I was livid. This wasn't her kitchen, and she'd turned it into a maze overnight. Still, I told myself to pick my battles. She'd only been here a week, and I didn't want to seem petty. But it didn't stop at the kitchen. Next, she started commenting on our groceries. "You really shouldn't buy so much processed food," she said one afternoon, eyeing a box of frozen meals I'd picked up for busy nights. "It's not good for you." "We don't eat them every day," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "Well, you should just cook from scratch," she continued, oblivious to my growing irritation. "I can show you some easy recipes if you'd like. It's not that hard." By the end of the week, I was at my wit's end. But what truly pushed me over the edge was her blatant disregard for our privacy. It started small, her borrowing things without asking. She'd take my hairbrush or my husband's razor, leaving them in odd places around the house. One day, I found my favorite sweater draped over the back of a chair in the guest room. When I confronted her about it, she waved me off. "I just needed something cozy," she said. "You weren't wearing it, so I figured you wouldn't mind." But the worst came a few days later. I came home from work to find her in our bedroom, sitting on my bed, flipping through my journal. My private journal. My heart dropped. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked up, completely unfazed. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said with a dismissive laugh. "I was just curious. You shouldn't leave things lying around if you don't want people to see them." "Lying around?" "It was in the nightstand drawer." I shot back, my hands shaking with anger. "Well, that's hardly a secure place," she said, as if I were the unreasonable one. "You should really invest in a lockbox if you're so worried about privacy." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was sitting on my bed, holding my journal, and somehow she had the audacity to act like I was at fault. "Get out," I said, my voice trembling. She raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," I said, pointing to the door. "Get out of my room."
Now.
She stood up slowly, making a show of putting the journal back on the nightstand. "There's no need to be rude," she said, brushing past me. "I didn't read anything interesting anyway." The second she was gone, I locked the bedroom door and sat down, trying to calm my racing heart. This was the final straw. I couldn't live like this. That night, I told my husband everything. "She went through my journal," I said, my voice shaking with frustration. "Our bedroom is supposed to be our space, and she's treating it like it's hers. This isn't okay." He looked horrified. "She did what?" "She said she was curious," I said, throwing my hands up. "But that's not the point. She has no respect for our privacy. This has to stop." He sighed, rubbing his temples.
"I'll talk to her," he said.
"This can't keep happening." True to his word, he tried. He sat her down the next morning and explained that she needed to respect our boundaries. He told her our bedroom was off limits and that she needed to ask before taking or moving anything. Her reaction? She laughed. "Oh, come on," she said, waving him off like it was no big deal. "You're acting like I broke into a bank. I'm family. Families share things. And honestly, she's being a little dramatic, don't you think?" I stood in the hallway, listening, and felt my blood boil.
Dramatic?
If anyone was being dramatic, it was her, with her constant sighs and complaints about how the guest room wasn't good enough for her. When my husband pushed back, she rolled her eyes. "Fine," she said with a sigh. "If it makes you two feel better, I'll stay out of your precious bedroom. But honestly, this is ridiculous." That was the beginning of a battle I hadn't signed up for. She backed off for now, but I knew it wouldn't last. If there was one thing I'd learned about my mother-in-law, it was that she never truly gave up. And I was right, because a few days later, she found a new way to push my buttons. After weeks of feeling like I was losing a battle in my own home, I got a call that changed everything. It was my sister-in-law, Karen. We weren't particularly close, but we'd always been polite during family gatherings. That day, her voice on the other end of the line carried a mix of hesitation and urgency. "Hey," she started. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I heard Mom moved in with you guys." I felt my shoulders slump as I sighed into the phone.
"Yeah."
She showed up out of nowhere, and it's been exhausting. Karen let out a bitter laugh. "I'm not surprised. She pulled the same stunt with us a few years ago. Only, she didn't just show up, she manipulated her way in. By the time she left, I swore I'd never let her stay again. Hearing this was like a weight lifting off my chest. For weeks, I'd been questioning myself, wondering if I was overreacting or being unfair. But knowing that someone else had been through the same thing made me feel validated for the first time since this nightmare began. She's been awful, I admitted. She moved in without asking, demanded our bedroom, reorganized my kitchen, and even went through my journal. It's like she thinks nothing belongs to us. It's all hers. Karen groaned. That sounds exactly like her. She's always had this way of making herself the center of everything. And if you don't give her what she wants, she'll play the victim and try to turn people against you. It was like Karen was reading my mind. My mother-in-law had been making snide comments to my husband, dropping hints that I was the problem, and playing the role of the misunderstood guest. Karen sighed, her tone softening. Look, I'll give you some advice. Stand your ground. Don't let her manipulate you. She'll push and push, but if you don't push back, she'll think she can do whatever she wants. The moment I stopped walking on eggshells, she realized I wasn't someone she could steamroll. That's when she finally left. Her words lit a fire in me. I'd been so focused on avoiding confrontation, on trying to keep the peace, that I hadn't realized I was enabling her behavior. Thanks, Karen, I said, my voice steadier than it had been in weeks. I needed to hear that.
Anytime, she said.
And if you need someone to vent to, I'm here. Just don't let her walk all over you. Trust me, it's the only way to deal with her. That conversation was a turning point for me. I decided right then and there that I was done tiptoeing around her. It was time to reclaim my home, literally and figuratively. The first thing I did was buy locks for our bedroom door. I didn't care if it seemed extreme. After finding her flipping through my journal, I wasn't taking any chances. The look on her face when she tried to walk in and found the door locked was priceless. What's this about? She asked, rattling the doorknob. We've decided to lock our room, I said calmly. It's our private space, and we'd like to keep it that way. She narrowed her eyes. You don't trust me? It's not about trust, I said, though we both knew it was. It's about boundaries. She huffed and muttered something under her breath, but walked away. I didn't care. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I'd taken back a piece of my life. Next, I tackled the kitchen. I spent an entire Saturday undoing all her reorganizations, putting everything back where it belonged. When she saw what I'd done, she tried to argue. Why did you move everything? She demanded, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. Because it's my kitchen, I said, not bothering to sugarcoat my tone. This is how I like it, and this is how it's going to stay. She looked at me like I'd grown two heads. You're being unreasonable, she said. No, I'm not, I replied. I've been more than patient, but this is my house. You don't get to come in and take over. I could see the wheels turning in her head, probably trying to come up with a way to spin this in her favor. But I stood my ground, and she eventually backed down. The biggest change, though, was my attitude. I stopped letting her comments get under my skin. When she criticized my cooking, I shrugged it off. When she left a mess in the living room, I handed her a trash bag and asked her to clean it up. One evening, she tried to guilt-trip me about how uncomfortable the guest room was. I'm not used to such a small space, she said, her voice dripping with self-pity. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, not missing a beat. But it's the best we can offer right now. If it's really that bad, we can help you look for other options. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked genuinely shocked. She didn't expect me to push back. From that point on, something shifted. She still made her snide comments, but they didn't have the same bite. She realized I wasn't the pushover she'd thought I was. That night, I told my husband about my conversation with Karen and how it had given me the confidence to stand up for myself. I wish I'd known sooner, I said. I feel like I've been going crazy. He sighed and pulled me into a hug. You're not crazy, he said. And I'm sorry I didn't step up more. This isn't fair to you, or to us. It was the first time in weeks that I felt like we were on the same page. I knew the battle wasn't over. My mother-in-law was nothing if not persistent, and I had no doubt she'd try something new soon. But for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. What I didn't realize was just how far she'd go to regain control, and how much worse things were about to get. I knew my newfound confidence would ruffle my mother-in-law's feathers, but I wasn't prepared for just how petty she could be. It started almost immediately after I reasserted control over my space. She didn't confront me directly anymore, no. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she adopted a passive-aggressive approach, one that slowly chipped away at my patience. The first sign of her new tactic appeared in the kitchen. I had spent an entire morning scrubbing the counters, doing the dishes, and mopping the floor, wanting to restore some semblance of order to my home. It felt good to see the space clean and organized again, at least for a little while. But by the time I came back from running errands that afternoon, the kitchen looked like a war zone. Dirty dishes were piled in the sink, crumbs were scattered across the counters, and a sticky spill of something unidentifiable had been left to congeal on the floor. I walked into the living room, where my mother-in-law was comfortably lounging on the couch, watching a daytime soap opera. "What happened to the kitchen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. She didn't even look up. "Oh, I made myself a little snack. I was going to clean up, but my back started acting up, so I thought I'd rest for a bit. A little snack." It looked like she'd hosted a dinner party for 5. I clenched my fists, biting back the urge to snap. "Could you clean it up when you feel better?" I asked, forcing a smile. She waved a dismissive hand. "Of course. No need to make such a big deal out of it." Spoiler alert, she never cleaned it up. This pattern repeated itself almost daily. She'd leave messes for me to clean, knowing it would irritate me. Sometimes it was the kitchen. Other times, she'd leave her laundry scattered across the living room or her toiletries spread out in the bathroom, turning every shared space into a reminder of her presence. But the thermostat wars were the most infuriating. I hated a hot house and usually kept the thermostat set to a comfortable 72 degrees. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, insisted that 80 degrees was the optimal temperature for comfort. I'd turn it back down, and within an hour, she'd sneak over and crank it back up. This went on for days, a silent tug-of-war that left me sweating in my own home. When I finally confronted her about it, she shrugged and said, "I just don't understand why you're so obsessed with being cold. It's not healthy, you know." Her pettiness wasn't confined to physical messes or temperature battles. She also weaponized her words, targeting me with backhanded compliments and snide remarks. One evening, I made dinner, spaghetti and meatballs, nothing fancy, but a meal my husband and I both enjoyed. As we sat down to eat, my mother-in-law took one bite, wrinkled her nose, and said, "Well, it's edible." I put my fork down and stared at her. "Excuse me?" "Oh, don't take it personally," she said, as if she hadn't just insulted me. "It's just not how I would make it. But I guess it's fine for a quick meal." She kept this up every chance she got. If I cleaned the house, she'd find something I missed. If I dressed up for an event, she'd comment on how my outfit wasn't her style. Every little dig felt calculated, designed to undermine me without giving me enough ammunition to fight back. The worst, though, was when she started playing the victim. She'd wait until my husband was at work, then call him with exaggerated tales of how I was mistreating her. "She won't even let me use the master bedroom," she'd complain, her voice trembling just enough to sound pitiful. "And she gets so upset over the smallest things. I just don't know what I did to deserve this." One day, she even cried on the phone, saying she felt unwelcome and didn't know how much longer she could stay in such a hostile environment. When my husband came home that evening, I could tell something was on his mind. "Mom called me today," he said carefully, sitting down at the kitchen table. "Let me guess," I said, crossing my arms. "She told you I'm treating her horribly, and she feels like a prisoner in our house?" He hesitated, clearly torn. "She did say she's been feeling unwelcome," he admitted. I laughed bitterly. "Of course she did. Did she also mention how she's been leaving messes everywhere, messing with the thermostat, and insulting my cooking?" He sighed. "I know she's difficult, but she's my mom. I just don't want to escalate things." "Neither do I," said, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "But she's pushing me, and if I don't push back, she'll walk all over us." To his credit, he stood by me. He told his mom that she needed to stop calling him with complaints and that if she had an issue, she should address it directly. Of course, she took this as further proof that I was turning him against her. At this point, I realized I needed to take a different approach. I started documenting everything. Every comment, every mess, every passive-aggressive stunt. I wrote it all down in a notebook, complete with dates and times. The day she left a pile of dirty dishes in the sink, I snapped a photo. The time she turned the thermostat up to 82 degrees, I wrote it down. The evening she told me my spaghetti tasted like something out of a can, that went in the notebook, too. I wasn't sure exactly how I'd use this information, but I had a feeling it would come in handy. At the very least, it gave me a sense of control a way to reclaim some power in a situation where I often felt powerless. Deep down, I knew her games weren't just about me. They were about control. She was testing the limits, trying to see how far she could push before I broke. But I wasn't going to break. Not this time. Little did I know, her next move would make the games she'd been playing so far look like child's play. The evening of the dinner party started off innocently enough. My husband and I had invited a small group of friends over for a casual meal, just a chance to unwind, share some laughs, and enjoy each other's company. I'd spent most of the afternoon cooking, setting the table, and making sure everything was perfect. I wanted the night to feel relaxed but still special. From the moment my mother-in-law stepped into the dining room, though, the air felt heavier. I could tell by the look on her face that she was gearing up for something. She wasn't one to pass up an audience, and tonight, she had one. "Oh, isn't this quaint?" she said as she took in the table settings. "You've really tried, haven't you?" I bit my tongue and smiled. "Thanks, I wanted to make it nice." She walked around the room, her eyes scanning every detail. Well, the centerpiece is interesting. A bit much, don't you think? Less is more, dear." My friends were still trickling in at this point, so I didn't want to make a scene. Instead, I just nodded and excused myself to check on the food. As dinner got underway, my mother-in-law's comments became less subtle. The first jab came when the salad was served. "This dressing is store-bought, isn't it?" she asked, tilting her head in that condescending way she had. I always say, homemade is the only way to go. But I guess some people just don't have the time. I smiled tightly. "I made the dressing myself, actually." "Oh," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Well, it's unique." I could feel my friends exchanging glances, but I pushed through. I wasn't going to let her ruin the evening. When we got to the main course, lasagna, one of my go-to dishes, she wasn't any kinder. She said, taking a small bite. "Well, it's not bad. A little heavy on the garlic, though. And the noodles could be cooked just a bit more. But, good effort." I glanced at my husband, hoping he'd say something to redirect the conversation, but he was busy chatting with one of our friends. Then came the comments about my appearance. As we were clearing plates and getting ready for dessert, one of my friends complimented my dress. "You look amazing tonight," she said. Before I could respond, my mother-in-law chimed in. "Oh, it's a nice dress, but I think something with a little more structure would suit her better. She's got a tricky figure, The table went quiet for a moment, and I felt my face flush. I wanted to say something, but I didn't want to ruin the night for everyone else. So I laughed it off, pretending it didn't bother me. The final straw came just as dessert was being served. My mother-in-law had been sipping on her wine, clearly feeling emboldened by the attention she was getting. She leaned back in her chair and, loud enough for the entire table to hear, said, "I'm just waiting for the day husband realizes he could have done better." The room went dead silent. I froze, the serving spoon in my hand hovering over a plate of tiramisu. My friends exchanged wide-eyed glances, unsure of how to react. I looked at my husband, who looked just as stunned as I felt. He opened his mouth to say something, but I beat him to it. "Well," I said, my voice trembling with anger, "if you feel that way, maybe you shouldn't be here." Her eyes widened, clearly not expecting me to respond. "Oh, don't be so sensitive," she said with a forced laugh. "It was just a joke." "No, it wasn't," I said, my tone firm. It was rude and completely out of line. After our friends left, I confronted her in the kitchen. I was still shaking from the evening's events, but I'd had enough. "Why do you feel the need to tear me down every chance you get?" I demanded. "Do you honestly think it's okay to speak to me like that in front of our friends?" She crossed her arms, her face a mask of mock innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was just being honest. If you can't handle a little constructive criticism, that's not my fault." "Constructive criticism?" I repeated, incredulous. "You insulted my cooking, my home, and my appearance. And then you had the nerve to suggest my husband could do better. That's not constructive. It's cruel." She rolled her eyes. "You're blowing this out of proportion. You're always so dramatic." That word, dramatic, was the final nail in the coffin. "If you don't like it here," I said, my voice ice cold, "you're free to leave." Her jaw dropped. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," I said, meeting her gaze. "I've tried to be patient, but you've made it clear you don't respect me or my home. If staying here makes you so unhappy, maybe it's time for you to find somewhere else to stay." For the first time since she moved in, she was at a loss for words. She stared at me, her face a mix of shock and anger, before storming off to the guest room. That night, my husband and I sat down to talk. "I can't do this anymore," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I've tried to make this work, but she's gone too far. If she stays, I don't know how much longer I can hold it together." He sighed, looking conflicted but understanding.
"You're right," he said.
"She crossed a line tonight. I'll talk to her tomorrow." I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I'd finally taken a step toward reclaiming my home. The morning after the dinner party felt oddly calm. For the first time in weeks, I woke up feeling like I had the upper hand. My mother-in-law hadn't emerged from the guest room yet, and I took full advantage of the quiet to enjoy my coffee in peace. I was flipping through the mail when I noticed an envelope that immediately stood out. It wasn't one of the usual bills or junk flyers we got daily. The envelope was formal, white with a glossy finish, and it was addressed to my mother-in-law. The return address read, "Law firm name, Attorneys at Law." My first thought was that it might be something mundane like paperwork related to her former apartment. But as I turned it over in my hands, curiosity gnawed at me. It felt heavier than a standard letter. Whatever it was important. When my mother-in-law finally shuffled into the kitchen, looking unusually subdued, I handed her the envelope. "This came for you," I said, watching her face closely. The change in her expression was immediate. Her eyes widened, and her face went pale. She stared at the envelope like it was a bomb about to go off. "Oh," she said, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." I expected her to open it right there, but she didn't. Instead, she clutched it tightly and hurried back to the guest room without another word. The rest of the day, her behavior was strange. For weeks, she'd made it her mission to micromanage my kitchen, constantly offering unsolicited advice and rearranging things to her liking. But that afternoon, she didn't step foot in the kitchen at all. When I started making dinner, I half expected her to hover over my shoulder with her usual criticisms. Instead, she stayed in the living room, quietly reading a magazine. It was so unlike her that I found myself pausing mid-recipe, waiting for some snide comment that never came. At dinner, she was uncharacteristically polite. She ate what I made without a single complaint and even thanked me when I passed her the bread basket. My husband gave me a puzzled look, and I knew he'd noticed the change, too. Then came the real shock. After dinner, she apologized. "I'm sorry if I've been difficult," she said, her tone unusually soft. "I know I haven't been the easiest guest." I almost dropped my glass. This was the same woman who had spent weeks tearing me down, and now she was apologizing? It felt surreal. Over the next few days, her behavior continued to shift. She stopped making comments about my cooking or my housekeeping. She no longer left her things strewn about the house. She even started doing small, thoughtful things, like washing her own dishes or tidying up the living room. For the first time, she felt more like a guest and less like a dictator. But as much as I wanted to enjoy the peace, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just her behavior, it was the way she carried herself. She seemed distracted. I'd catch her staring off into space, her brow furrowed as if she was lost in thought. Once, I heard her muttering under her breath in the guest room, but when I knocked on the door to ask if everything was okay, she quickly brushed me off. I couldn't stop wondering about that envelope. What had been in it? And why had it affected her so profoundly? One afternoon, I finally broke down and brought it up with my husband. "Have you noticed how different your mom's been acting?" I asked as we cleaned up the kitchen. He nodded. "Yeah, it's been weird. I mean, I'm not complaining, but it's like she's a completely different person." I hesitated before bringing up the letter. "Do you think it has anything to do with that envelope she got the other day? From the lawyers?" His brow furrowed. "Maybe. She hasn't said anything about it, though. Don't you think that's strange?" I pressed. "She's not exactly the type to keep quiet about things, especially something that's clearly bothering her." He shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe it's personal." That was the end of the conversation, but my curiosity only grew. A few days later, I found her sitting on the back porch, staring at her phone. She looked stressed, her shoulders hunched, and her face tight with worry. I decided to take a chance. "Hey," I said, stepping outside. "Everything okay?" She jumped slightly, clearly startled, and quickly locked her phone screen. "Oh, yes," she said, forcing a smile. "Everything's fine." I didn't believe her for a second. "You've seemed a little preoccupied lately," I said gently. "If there's anything you need to talk about." "I'm fine," she interrupted, her tone sharper than I expected. "Really? There's nothing to worry about." Her reaction only made me more suspicious. But I knew better than to push her. That night, As I was getting ready for bed, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head. Whatever was going on, it was big enough to shake her to her core. And while I didn't know what it was yet, I had a feeling it wouldn't stay a secret for long. The next morning, I overheard her on the phone in the guest room. Her voice was low, but her words were sharp. "I told you I'm handling it," she said. "Just give me more time." "No, I can't do that right now." "I don't care what they say. I'll figure something out." I couldn't make out the other person's response, but the tension in her voice was unmistakable. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of power. Whatever was in that letter had put her on edge. She was no longer in control, no longer the one calling the shots. And while I didn't know what it was yet, I couldn't help but feel like the balance was finally shifting in my favor. Little did I know, the truth would come out soon enough, and it would be even more explosive than I could have imagined. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when my phone buzzed with a call from Karen, my sister-in-law. After our last conversation, I'd been keeping her updated on the chaos unfolding in my house, and she'd been a comforting voice of reason. Still, I wasn't prepared for what she had to say this time. "Hey, I've got some news," Karen said, her tone hesitant. "What is it?" I asked, sitting down at the kitchen table.
"It's about Mom," she said.
I didn't want to say anything before because I wasn't sure, but, well, I think I know why she's staying with you. My heart skipped a beat. "Go on." Karen sighed. "She's being sued by her old landlord. Apparently, she trashed her apartment before she moved out. The letter you saw? That was probably a court summons." For a moment, I didn't say anything. The pieces were clicking into place in my mind, and the picture they formed was infuriating. My mother-in-law wasn't staying with us out of convenience or because she needed support. She was hiding. She thought she could avoid her problems by camping out in our home, letting us bear the brunt of her presence while she avoided taking responsibility. "You've got to be kidding me," I finally said, my voice low and angry. "I wish I were," Karen replied. "I heard about it through a friend who still lives in her old building. Apparently, she caused a ton of damage. Holes in the walls, broken appliances, the works. The landlord is suing her for thousands of dollars." It all made sense now. The sudden move, the complete lack of consideration, her unusual behavior after receiving that letter, it was all connected. She wasn't just an overbearing guest, she was a runaway tenant. When I told my husband what Karen had said, he looked completely blindsided. "Mom's being sued?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "Looks like it," I said, crossing my arms. "And instead of dealing with it, she decided to crash here and hope it all blows over." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't even know what to say." "How about, she needs to leave?" I suggested, my tone sharper than I intended. He hesitated. "I mean, if she's in trouble, shouldn't we help her?" I stared at him. Disbelief etched across my face. "Help her? She lied to us, manipulated us, and turned our lives upside down so she could avoid the consequences of her own actions. How does that deserve help?" "I get what you're saying," he said, holding up his hands defensively. "But she's my mom. It's not that simple." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I get that you love her, but we can't keep enabling her. She needs to face this, or she's never going to stop." That evening, I decided to confront her. I waited until after dinner, when she was sitting in the living room pretending to watch TV, but clearly lost in thought. "Can we talk?" I asked, standing in the doorway. She looked up, her face carefully neutral. "What about?" I stepped into the room, arms crossed. "About why you're really here." Her expression didn't change, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "I'm here because I needed a place to stay," she said, her voice measured. "Sure," I said, nodding. "But that's not the whole story, is it? I know about the lawsuit, the damages to your old apartment. I know about the court summons." Her face went pale, just like it had the day the letter arrived. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice a little too high-pitched to sound convincing. "Don't lie to me," I said firmly. "Karen told me everything. You trashed your old place, and now you're being sued. That's why you're here, not because you needed help, but because you wanted to hide." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time since she'd moved in, she looked genuinely flustered. Finally, she sighed and sank back into the couch.
"Fine," she said.
"You're right. I didn't want to deal with it, okay? I thought if I stayed here for a while, I could figure things out without complicating things further." I stared at her, incredulous. "So, your solution was to dump your problems on us? To turn our lives upside down so you could avoid dealing with your own mess?" "I didn't mean for it to be like this," she said, her voice defensive. I just needed time. My husband walked in then, having overheard the conversation from the hallway. He looked at his mom, disappointment written all over his face. Mom, you should have told us, he said. We could have helped you, but instead, you lied to us. Do you have any idea how much stress this has caused? She looked down, fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. I didn't know what else to do, she admitted quietly. Well, here's what you're going to do now, I said, my voice steady. You're going to handle this. You're going to face the lawsuit, deal with the landlord, and figure out how to pay for the damages. Because we're not going to let you keep running away from this. She looked up at me, her eyes wide. You can't just kick me out, she said, her voice trembling. I'm not kicking you out yet, I said. But if you don't start taking responsibility, I'm not going to keep letting you stay here. This is your mess, and it's time you cleaned it up. The conversation ended with her retreating to the guest room, clearly shaken. My husband and I stayed up late that night, talking about what to do next. She's not going to change unless we make her, I said. We can't keep enabling her. He nodded, though I could see the pain in his eyes. You're right, he said. It's just hard, you know? She's my mom. I know, I said, squeezing his hand. But sometimes the best way to help someone is to let them face the consequences of their actions. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were on the same page. Now it was up to her to decide what came next. Little did I know, the fallout from this confrontation would be even messier than I'd anticipated. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of grim determination. The conversation from the night before lingered in my mind, and I knew it was time to take action. My husband and I had been far too lenient, and it was clear that my mother-in-law would continue to avoid her responsibilities unless we set a firm boundary. Over breakfast, I laid out my plan to my husband. We need to have a serious talk with your mom, I said, stirring my coffee. No more dancing around the issue. She needs to know we won't tolerate this anymore. He looked hesitant but nodded. You're right. We've let this go on too long. But she's not going to take it well. I know, I said. But we can't keep living like this. She's making her problems our problems, and it's not fair. We need to give her a choice. Handle her legal issues and move out, or we take drastic measures. What kind of drastic measures? He asked, raising an eyebrow. I don't know yet, I admitted. But if she doesn't step up, we can't let her stay here indefinitely. It's time for her to face the consequences. We decided to confront her that afternoon. She was in the living room, scrolling on her phone, when we sat down across from her. The tension in the room was palpable. Mom, my husband began, his voice calm but firm, we need to talk. She looked up, her expression wary. What is it? I took a deep breath and cut straight to the point. We know about the lawsuit. We know why you left your apartment and why you've been staying here. Her face froze, and for a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she let out a nervous laugh. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to us, I said, pulling the letter from the lawyer out of my pocket. This showed up in the mail. We've already spoken to Karen, and she confirmed everything. You trashed your apartment, and now you're being sued for damages. Her expression shifted from denial to panic. It's not as bad as it sounds, she said quickly. I just had a few disagreements with the landlord. They're exaggerating everything. My husband leaned forward, his tone serious. Mom, this isn't about disagreements. You're being sued. You can't just ignore it and hope it goes away. She looked between the two of us, her eyes wide. I'm not ignoring it, she said defensively. I just needed some time to figure things out. You've had time, I said, my patience wearing thin. But instead of dealing with the problem, you ran away from it and dumped it on us. That's not fair. At that point, her demeanor changed. Her voice softened, and she leaned back on the couch, trying to appear vulnerable. I didn't mean to cause any trouble, she said, her eyes glistening with tears. I've just been so overwhelmed. I didn't know where else to go. She was pulling the guilt card, and I wasn't falling for it. We understand that you're going through a tough time, I said. But that doesn't excuse lying to us or making us carry your burden. This is your mess, and you need to take responsibility for it. I don't have anywhere else to go, she said, her voice trembling. If you make me leave, I'll be out on the street. Her words were like a knife to my husband's heart. I could see the conflict in his eyes, and for a moment, I thought he might cave.
But then he surprised me.
Mom, no one's saying you have to leave immediately, he said. But you can't stay here forever. You need to start taking steps to resolve this. That means contacting the landlord, working out a payment plan, and figuring out where you're going to live next. She shook her head, her tears flowing freely now. I can't afford to pay them. They're asking for thousands of dollars. I don't have that kind of money. This was the moment I decided to lay down the ultimatum. Then you need to figure out a plan, I said, my voice firm. Because here's the deal. You have two options. Either you start handling this, or you move out. We're not going to let you stay here and avoid your problems anymore. Her head snapped up, and her tears dried almost instantly. You're kicking me out? She asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and anger.
We're giving you a choice, I said.
But if you refuse to take responsibility, we can't let you keep living here. It's not fair to us, and it's not helping you. She stared at me for a long moment, her jaw clenched. You're being unreasonable, she said finally.
No, I replied.
What's unreasonable is expecting us to clean up your mess while you sit here pretending nothing's wrong. This is your problem, and it's time you owned it. The conversation ended with her storming off to the guest room, slamming the door behind her. My husband and I sat in silence for a few minutes, processing what had just happened. Do you think she'll listen? He asked finally. I don't know, I admitted. But we had to do something. If she doesn't change, we'll have to follow through. That night, the house felt heavy with tension. I didn't know what my mother-in-law's next move would be, but I had a sinking feeling that this wasn't the end of the battle. Little did I know, things were about to escalate in ways I couldn't have imagined. The day after we gave her the ultimatum, I woke up expecting a standoff. Part of me was bracing for another round of arguments, guilt trips, or passive-aggressive digs. Instead, I walked into the living room and found her packing her things. She had her suitcases lined up near the door, and she was quietly folding clothes into a duffel bag. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. After weeks of tension, chaos, and constant battles, this sudden shift felt almost surreal. You're leaving? I asked, my tone cautious. She didn't look up as she zipped the bag. Yes, she said curtly. It's clear I'm not welcome here. It wasn't the dramatic explosion I'd been anticipating, but her tone carried enough bitterness to make her feelings clear. As the morning went on, she continued packing in silence. Occasionally, she'd mutter something under her breath, fragments of complaints about being unappreciated or how some people couldn't recognize family loyalty. At one point, my husband tried to help her carry a suitcase to the car, but she waved him off. I can manage, she said stiffly. I wouldn't want to inconvenience anyone. I stayed out of her way, partly because I didn't trust myself not to say something that would reignite the tension. My husband gave me a few worried glances, but I shook my head. We'd made our decision, and now we had to stick to it. By midday, the guest room was empty, and her things were packed into her car. As she stood by the door, keys in hand, she turned to us with a strained smile. Well, I suppose this is goodbye, she said. I hope you'll both be happy with your decision. My husband tried to soften the moment. Mom, we're not cutting you out of our lives. We just need you to handle this situation. She gave a short, humorless laugh. Of course. I'll handle it. Don't worry about me. And with that, she walked out the door. As soon as her car pulled out of the driveway, a wave of relief washed over me. For the first time in weeks, the house felt quiet, peaceful, even. I stood in the kitchen, looking around at the space that was finally mine again. No more rearranged cabinets. No more unsolicited comments about my cooking. No more thermostat wars. When my husband came in, he wrapped his arms around me. How are you feeling? He asked. Like I can finally breathe, I said, leaning into him. He nodded. I know it was hard, but I think we did the right thing. For the rest of the day, we basked in the newfound calm. We didn't talk about her, didn't dwell on the drama. Instead, we focused on reconnecting with each other and reclaiming our home. A few weeks later, just as I was beginning to believe we'd seen the last of her chaos, a letter arrived in the mail. It was addressed to me, written in her unmistakable handwriting. For a brief moment, I wondered if it might be an apology, a rare olive branch from a woman who rarely admitted she was wrong. But when I opened it, any hope of reconciliation vanished. Inside was a 2-page letter filled with flowery language and thinly veiled guilt trips. She didn't outright apologize for her behavior, but she did mention how difficult her situation was and how she hoped I'd find it in my heart to help her. The kicker came in the final paragraph. If you could loan me just a few $1,000s to get back on my feet, I'd be eternally grateful. I know you're generous, and I'm counting on your kindness during this challenging time. I stared at the letter, equal parts amused and infuriated. After everything she'd put us through, she had the audacity to ask for money? I didn't even bother responding. In the weeks and months that followed, life gradually returned to normal. My husband and I focused on rebuilding the peace in our home, strengthening our relationship, and enjoying the freedom that came with setting boundaries. Occasionally, we'd hear updates about my mother-in-law through Karen. She'd moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, and while she was still dealing with the lawsuit, she seemed to be managing, though not without plenty of complaints, of course. As for me, I'd learned an important lesson about boundaries and the importance of standing up for myself. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always pretty, but it was worth it. And as I stood in my kitchen one sunny afternoon, sipping a cup of coffee and enjoying the quiet, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for my husband, for our home, and for the peace we'd finally reclaimed.